Welcome to Dynasty Life. I'm Theo Gremminger. Redraft ends, but Dynasty is life. And I had to bring my guest Ryan Heath from Fantasy Points back on. This is a action-packed week 7 we just had. We're going to talk about players that you should be trading for right now in your Dynasty leagues. But before we do that, we're going to cover a lot of topics reacting to the stuff we've seen this season as a whole, and specifically some of the recent developments. Ryan, how are you doing today, and what do you have going on these days at Fantasy Points?
Hey, I'm doing great, man. And yeah, I have a lot going on at Fantasy Points. Probably the two biggest are Dynasty Points, every Tuesday night podcast with the great Thomas Tipple, Jacob Sanderson, Lucas Gilbert. That's live every Tuesday night on the Fantasy Points YouTube channel. And right now, as we're recording this, I have Week 7's 5 stats to know live on fantasypoints.com. That's a totally free article that just kind of takes you through all the most important stats that I found for Week 7. So definitely go check that out.
Yeah, and I read that one this morning. That was really, really well written. Very, very cool stuff. We're going to touch on a couple of those subjects here. And anybody listening on the podcast, Ryan is absolutely trying to flex on me, a Long Islander and a Knicks fan, by wearing a Boston Celtics t-shirt. I think it's a long sleeve tee, maybe a sweatshirt. I'm not sure, but it's a Boston. Okay, there you go. Long sleeve tee flex right here on Dynasty Life, trying to get in my head for the NBA opener that's going to be on Tuesday evening. I'm excited for that one, but we're not here to talk NBA. We're here to talk fantasy football. And why don't we just start out with it? You got a Patriots jersey in the background. You're a Patriots fan. You're a New Englander. And Drake Maye. Drake Maye has now given us back-to-back weeks of QB1 performances. The game flow is absolutely ideal. The Patriots are a train wreck. Drake Maye has a big arm. You're getting a ton of pass attempts. We saw 2 weeks ago in his debut him lead the team in rushing yardage. Like, how enthusiastic are you about Drake Maye moving forward, Ryan?
Yeah, I'll say as a Patriots fan, I'm very enthusiastic. I think he's looked great. Obviously, like some little issues and stuff. He's still kind of jumpy in the pocket. He's not always picking up every blitzer or what have you. But yeah, this guy can escape the pocket. He can make throws on the run. It's fun to watch. Yeah, so very excited about that. For fantasy, I think this is the type of quarterback where in a better situation, you could close your eyes and imagine him posting top 5, top 6 numbers. I don't think that's at all within the range of outcomes this season. But it could be one of those situations where it's like, okay, Stephon Diggs goes to Buffalo and suddenly Josh Allen is a top fantasy quarterback, right? I could see something like that happen in the future for May. I think his talent is close enough to that level where you're excited about the fantasy football upside as well.
So I'll push back slightly. I think that even though the situation is kind of dire in terms of the weapons around him, in terms of the offensive line, I think the game flow and the spike weeks, maybe it's not going to be a consistent one, Ryan, but this is a quarterback where I could see him rattling off like 3-4 big ones in a row. So I think Drake Maye, for me, like if it's a redraft context, he's a guy I'm really excited to add off the waiver wire. He's certainly like has a lot more juice than some of the other potential streaming options. And Demario Douglas, I think that was one where this past week, he got sick, had to leave the game. Demario Douglas being there, Hunter Henry being there, there's like enough guys that can kind of catch the ball and fit in with him. But for me, I don't think we've fully seen the rushing upside unlocked. I think we'll see that over the next few weeks. So I'm going to stay super, super bullish on Drake Maye. Want to talk to you about another situation, though. That's almost like we're having an emergency PSA, an emergency dynasty PSA. Bobby Slowick was a guy last year where like, hey, Bobby Slowick, you're amazing. Look at what you're doing with CJ Stroud. Look at what you're doing with the next man in. Noah Brown comes in, gives us like 3 wide receiver 1 weeks. And obviously we had the breakout for Tank Dell, breakout for Nico Collins. This year, though, I'm starting to get a little annoyed at our guy, Bobby Slowick. Joe Mixon is eating. Joe Mixon, every time he's healthy, Bobby Slowick wants to get him the ball a million times. And that seemed kind of apparent. But against the Patriots last week, you had a CJ Stroud 3-touchdown pass performance where we had Tank Dell. We're like, Tank Dell is back. I wrote about it in The Athletic this week. Like, I was all enthusiastic about Tank Dell. Tank Dell is back, I think, was one of the headlines I had. And he definitely isn't back. He had 2 end zone targets, 4 targets, 0 catches, and the overall passing volume was obscenely low. 21 pass attempts. CJ Stroud has only finished as a QB1 twice this season. What is going on in Houston? Is this something where it's a reaction to the Nico Collins injury? Is this something we just need to like roll with the punches on? Or are you downgrading Houston Texans? Like, what is the data telling you, Ryan?
So I think Slovic is kind of falling into a trap that a lot of play callers tend to, where when the pass protection isn't great, which it certainly hasn't been great in Houston this year, they made a Packers pass rush that has ranked bottom 5 in most categories, look incredible yesterday, right? I think a lot of play callers, when they see their offensive line struggling in pass pro like that, will say, okay, we're going to keep a balanced game plan. We're going to run the ball on first down. But the problem is Slovic does it to the point that it's very predictable. I had a tweet out yesterday over the Texans' final 3 drives where, again, they're trailing in this game for most of the second half. On 1st and 10, Slovic called a run play 9 out of 10 times. And that is resulting in 2nd and longs, in 3rd and longs. And that's when CJ Stroud's going to get eaten up by the blitz because, yeah, they know you have to pass now. Like it becomes just a very predictable situation. I mean, it's great for Joe Mixon. His workload has been unmatched in his 3 healthy games. And I do think it's like a Joe Mixon man crush type thing too. The Texans have ran the ball the 3rd most of any team in the red zone in games he's played, but they're outside the top 20 in games he hasn't. So yeah, I do think this is partially a Joe Mixon problem in terms of Slovic just having a man crush and being obsessed. But yeah, I don't know. You would hope this offense opens up more with Collins coming back. But yeah, I don't know. Or maybe they just take the lesson from yesterday from that loss. So yeah, it's hard to fully have a take here on what I think is going to happen going forward. But I can at least diagnose exactly what's been happening so far, I think.
Yeah, agree. And I think you nailed it. I think we have to hope that there's a little bit of like self-scouting, which is like, hey, this is our franchise quarterback and we want to feature him. And there should never be a situation at any point in CJ Stroud's career that he fails to crack 100 passing yards. And I'll say, like, that he was like inaccurate yesterday. Obviously, he had the 2 end zone targets to Tank Dell, but he was inaccurate yesterday. It was the lowest completion percentage that we've seen from CJ Stroud by a mile this year as well. So I think like the Indianapolis game is a chance for them to get right. The Jets suddenly look a lot more beatable. That game will be in New York. And then that Detroit Lion game in Houston seems like the kind of game that could really, really pop off. And like you said, Nico Collins is going to come back. But yeah, it's sort of like the Anthony Richardson, CJ Stroud tier in redraft and also in dynasty startups. Those 2 guys, Richardson's a whole nother story. That's a lot worse situation right now. But CJ Stroud as well. Like you saw people trying to make the argument for taking CJ Stroud at the 101 in dynasty startups. That's certainly not looking like a strong strategy at this point. So we'll say the jury is still out on these Texans, but yeah, I think you're right. It's a little bit of a man crush situation. And really, Ryan, sort of off topic, is not on the show sheet, but we've seen all of these veteran running backs who signed as free agents this offseason, all just completely dominating. Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry at the top, but then all these guys like Aaron Jones, Tony Pollard, Joe Mixon, J.K. Dobbins, and I'm not even mentioning all of them. It's something like 7 of them. Josh Jacobs is an RB2 right now. Any kind of takeaway, is this a trend that you think we're going to start seeing, or this is a kind of a one-off situation of older running back moves teams and gets featured right away? As an ageist, what do you think of this?
Yeah, exactly. So this is obviously something I have written about a lot this past offseason, and something I think about a lot is, yeah, the age curve at the running back position, but also specifically how running backs tend to perform on the 2nd contract, on the 3rd contract, right? So what I would say is, yeah, what we're seeing this year goes completely against pretty much every discernible trend from the past decade plus of what generally happens when a running back signs with a new team when they're over the age of 26 or 27, right? But I would say the reason for that is this, if you just remember back, the 2017 running back class is probably the best in modern NFL history, just with all of the talent and all of the guys that entered the league at that point. A lot of those names you just rattled off were from that class, or the one right before, or right after, right? So I think we're just at a point in the NFL where that band of talent are the ones that are signing these contracts. And that's something we have to remember in our analysis, right? This will be like a lesson learned for me. I can tell you every offseason I write like a lessons learned article. This is going to be probably right there at the top. Is we always need to lead with talent when we're analyzing trends, right? Because it's the talent that drives those trends that we see. Most of the time, your average 27-year-old running back on his second contract is probably doesn't have that much juice anymore, right? And we certainly made those arguments with like a Joe Mixon this past season, but I think you have to keep in mind that every player is different, right? And when we are trying to apply like a previous aggregate performance of a bunch of guys to a bunch of individual players going into a season, it gets dangerous, right? So yeah, I'll take the L on like the Alvin Kamara fade, on the Derrick Henry fade for this season. It's pretty clear that I was incorrect there.
Well, I'll say it's still early for the Alvin Kamara one because the Saints offense could completely fall off. There's some things there, but yeah, Derrick Henry one, it's been one where there's been sharp people fading him for like 4 years now. He's just a different kind of guy. What's really interesting is the RB1 overall, it goes from Eckler to Christian McCaffrey to potentially a 30-year-old Derrick Henry. It's like that trend will snap. It's a young man. It's been a young man's position for years and years and years. And I'll say this story still has not fully been told, where it's week 7. These guys like Ken Walker in his 3rd season, Kyren Williams, Ken Walker in his 4th season, Kyren in his 3rd season, Bijan, Breece Hall, Jahmyr Gibbs. Like, the second half story could be the ascension of these younger players. We're going to continue this conversation, and we're going to give you the players that you should be trading for right now after we take a quick break. Theo Gremminger with Ryan Heath of Fantasy Points right here on Dynasty Life. We'll see you in a few.
Hey, I know DFS may have peaked, but there are still hundreds of thousands of people to play and millions of dollars up for grabs every week. So let's put our hoodie on and let's talk about Player Profiler's DFS Dominator. It has a cash game optimizer that leverages the projections from Billy and Theo and Bradley and Evan and that Player Profiler AI engine to create cash game lineups that certainly have a high floor, but also give you that ceiling. Now, you've probably heard about the most powerful tool of all, our Lineup Genius. We know winning GPPs requires a completely different approach, which is why our Lineup Genius takes you through the process of selecting the quarterbacks in the juiciest matchups. Then it highlights the stacks and runbacks that are available, lets you pick the chalk level, lets you pick the level of correlation with a number of other proprietary settings available to you. Click a button and it generates hundreds of lineups to be imported into FanDuel and DraftKings. And it's just $45 a year, not a week, a year. So for that reason alone, if you play DFS, you'd be an idiot not to buy the DFS Dominator.
Welcome back to Dynasty Life. Theo Gremminger with Ryan Heath of Fantasy Points. Ryan, let's stick with the running back position. We've had two sort of developments over the past 2 weeks. Breece Hall, we had the catastrophic back-to-back weeks in weeks 4 and week 5. And then week 6 and week 7 has just been complete trend up. We obviously saw Robert Saleh fired, and we also saw a change of the guard in terms of play caller with Todd Downing taking over for Nathaniel Hackett. What has been your takeaway with the Breece Hall usage after the sort of regime change / play caller switch?
Oh, it's a massive like rocket ship emoji, right? So in these past 2 games, Hall is up at an 84% snap share. That would rank behind only Kyren Williams this season. 83% of the backfield rush attempts, 5 out of 6 red zone opportunities. Yeah, this is incredible. And the passing game usage is even better. I run a route on 68% of dropbacks over the last 2 weeks, over a 20% target share. Those are like peak Christian McCaffrey numbers if he can keep this up for an entire season. I'm not like entirely convinced that he will. I think Braelon Allen could mix in a little bit more as the season goes on, But it's super encouraging, right? And if this keeps up, then yeah, Hall is going to project as a top 3 running back every single week, and I'm pretty excited about it. So I think we've kind of been saved. We've kind of been bailed out here.
1,000,000% agree with you, and I love the Christian McCaffrey analogy, because if I would have told you a couple days ago that you get a 38 rushing yard performance from Breece Hall, then you'd say, oh, this is a game where it was like a 14-10 Jets-Pittsburgh game, and it was really ugly, and that's why it was nobody scored fantasy points. But he gives you the 6 receptions, and he gets over 100 receiving yards. And this is a week after he gets a season high at the time. I was writing about last week, the season high 56 receiving yards. Like 56 receiving yards, I'll take it. 103 is a whole different ballgame. And I talked about this with Scott last week. I'm anybody on Dynasty Life, I'm doing a podcast with Scott Barrett of Fantasy Points every week called School of Scott. And we talked about how Breece Hall could be like the winner that if the pie grows larger in New York argument with Devontae Adams showing up. Now, the pie certainly didn't grow larger last night. The offense was not good, but Breece Hall was just cooking. So yeah, all the Breece Hall sadness for like those 2 weeks of the year, that might end up being like something we go back and kind of laugh about if Breece Hall does deliver and does give us like a potential league winning environment. And I know you had a Braelon Allen like goal line attempt in week 6 that got stuffed. So that threat is still there, but it seems like much less of a threat than it was with Robert Saleh and Nathaniel Hackett than we're seeing now. So I'm totally there. Another running back who we weren't in like the dire straits zone, but we were in sort of a frustration zone, was Bijan Robinson. Bijan, we had the Falcons offense ascending, and at the same time we had Bijan with like 1 touchdown score through 5 weeks played, and really a lack of like huge upside, a lack of huge touches. Now we're seeing it turn around where Bijan's given us back-to-back weeks of 20 plus PPR points scored, gets a touchdown last week, and then this week gets us 2 touchdowns, and really everything was trending up. He has a season high in rushing yardage, also gives us a very strong performance as a receiver. Like, we're fully back with Bijan Robinson, or are you still like a little bit cautious, or is it sort of like, hey, we're there?
So I was still cautious after week 6 because the utilization hadn't really come back up yet, but it did in week 7, right? Robinson played on every single one of his team's red zone snaps this past week. That was just 43% in weeks 4 through week 6. At Fantasy Points, we have a metric called XFP, expected fantasy points, just kind of a one-size-fits-all usage volume metric. And Robinson saw his best share of his backfield's expected fantasy points since week 1. So, yeah, I think he's back. And I think it's pretty easy in hindsight, especially to attribute the injuries to the reduction in his workload over the previous 3 weeks. I don't know that he ever carried a designation heading into the weekend, but in weeks 4 through 6, he was listed with either a shoulder or a hamstring injury, at least at one point during the week. So I think the takeaway here is that the Falcons coaching staff is going to be pretty conservative with like the minor injuries, with wanting to let him heal up, which makes sense. They have Tyler Algier. They have that luxury. They want to keep him healthy the whole season. But yeah, I think especially for like DFS purposes, for example, it's going to be important to pay attention to the midweek injury reports for Robinson, where if he's totally clean, then yeah, I think he is this high-end RB1 bell cow that we were promised and that we were hoping. But yeah, if he gets nicked up again, I wouldn't be that surprised to see it shift back to what we saw over the previous 3 weeks.
And I'm with you. And I think that it was like there's certain caution with this coaching staff where it seems like they want to cap his touches whenever possible. But it's just, he's such a hard player to not get the ball in his hands as he's really like moving along like this. The frustration was in week 6, him getting the 2 touchdowns, and then Tyler Algier still giving us like 100 rushing yard game with a touchdown as well, where you're like, hey, that was supposed to be my 40-pointer for Bijan. But yeah, there's nothing but positivity here. A little bit of trepidation because it sort of seems like he's got a capped volume ceiling some weeks, But like you said, everything's sort of trending up. One situation where this is one where you got to dive deeper into the box score, because I think a lot of people are going to look at the Chase Brown 7 PPR points game yesterday against Cleveland as a big negative, and certainly it is. But there were some positives yesterday in terms of the touch distribution with what the Bengals are doing. 17-9 in terms of the touches for Brown versus Moss. Do you think this is a situation where the two players are going to separate from one another and Brown's going to become more and more of a guy that we can trust in our lineups? Or do you think this is a headache backfield, Ryan?
I mean, I was pretty encouraged by the Chase Brown usage yesterday. Yeah. So the number that jumped out to me most was that for the first time all season, Brown actually ran more routes than Zach Moss did. That's kind of been what has been capping Brown so far, is that the Bengals don't seem to trust him in pass pro. He was graded among the worst pass protectors in the league his rookie season. That was kind of my trepidation coming into the season with him. But he's very clearly the more explosive back on the ground. He ranks top 5 in missed tackles force per carry this season. So, yeah, I think especially if they're slowly trusting him more and more in the passing game, then, yeah, I think he could pull away with this backfield by the end of the season. If that's like an RB2, low-end RB2 kind of expectation in the near term is probably where I would peg that at. I think it's hard, though, when it comes to like Dynasty. Are we buying Chase Brown? I don't know that Brown has the talent profile to just take over a backfield or ever be any sort of bell cow, or to like stay out to fend off like a free agent signing, for example. He, at this point, at his current cost, at how he's currently viewed, I'm not trying to go out and pay the iron price for him. But yeah, I think if you have Brown, if you've been holding him since earlier in the offseason, then yeah, you should be pretty happy. It does look like he's going to win out here ultimately.
I think that's a great point by Ryan. I think that like last year, the big threat was the free agent running backs kind of nuking values of players that we thought maybe had a pathway. And that was a something that we thought Chase Brown sort of avoided with Zach Moss. And early on, it looked like maybe they overvalued Zach Moss, but life is sort of finding a way for a more efficient player to get the ball more. I do think with a guy like Brown, though, if someone in your league is valuing him as a long-term asset because he happens to be a second-year player, then you should cash out, because this is the sort of player that's going to get nuked this offseason, potentially in what could end up being a very, very deep class of running backs. We're not going to dive too far into it, but basically like a for dummies look at this upcoming 2025 draft class would be, if you have been waiting around for running back help is absolutely on the way. Even in your super flex leagues, there's going to be multiple running backs that are first rounders. This is going to be an impactful class, a little closer to like the Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs class, certainly than this past year. More so even talent than the Breece Hall, Ken Walker class to kind of get a little bit further back there. So we'll stay away from the prospect talk now. Too much to cover today, but be careful with these guys that are not true long-term running back assets. There's going to be some threats coming up in this draft, and not just in the second round. There's going to be some third rounders as well. But one guy who we're not worried at all about is Brian Thomas. Now, Brian Thomas, it should be considered the dynasty wide receiver what? And give me a range here, Ryan. You don't have to pigeonhole. You don't need to tell me he's my wide receiver 7 or my wide receiver 11. But this is a player where you need to have him as a wide receiver 1 in dynasty. Am I incorrect?
No, I agree completely. Yeah, I would put him somewhere between the wide receiver 7 to wide receiver 9 range. I think that's going to depend a little bit how much you value current production versus obviously future production and youth and all that. And depending on your roster, what that makes sense for. But yeah, I think the only wide receivers I would very solidly rather have than Thomas at this point would be Jefferson, Chase, Lamb, Malik Neighbors, Amon-Ra, and Nico Collins. That one might be a little controversial. But yeah, it's been unbelievable what Thomas has done so far. I had a tweet out yesterday. There are only 7 rookie wide receivers to average more fantasy points per game in their rookie season than Thomas is currently. Their names are Odell Beckham, Malik Neighbors, Jamar Chase, Puka Nacua, Justin Jefferson, Michael Thomas, Mike Evans. So it's just to put it in historical context, what Thomas is currently doing, it's pretty incredible. Yeah, I know I was a little skeptical coming in on him as a prospect, but yeah, he's just kind of blown away any concerns I had about like a limited route tree that he ran in college. So yeah. I think we can be pretty excited.
And that's another one where this is going to be like a cautionary tale, because I think like Ladd McConkey is certainly not a bust by any means. I think he looks like a guy who's going to be a long-term asset for you on your dynasty roster. Never going to be really I don't think we're ever going to see him reach the pinnacle that we thought potentially during rookie draft season. There's still going to be some Ladd McConkey truthers out there. Definitely let me know if I'm wrong and you still think Ladd McConkey is going to be some 100 catch guy at some point soon in this prehistoric offense under Greg Roman. But the whole I'm going to take Xavier Worthy and I'm going to take Ladd McConkey over Brian Thomas just was the incorrect move this past rookie season. And I think that a lot of people who did so kind of need to look back and say, why were we fading this player that stepped into a wide receiver 1 level role with a quarterback who's produced fantasy numbers? Christian Kirk was a wide receiver 1. Calvin Ridley was wide receiver 18 last year. Evan Ingram, back-to-back seasons of top 5 tight end production. And the whole mental gymnastics of, I get it, the limited route tree, all that kind of stuff. But the guy led the SEC with 17 touchdown grabs up opposite Malik Neighbors. Just, he's that guy. And I think you're right about where to value him. Sort of like, he's a great guy to try to tier up to in Dynasty. He's like, you bring up Nico Collins. It's sort of like, that's an interesting argument because Nico, it took him a couple years. Brian Thomas is certainly way more at this upwards trajectory. And I know you love stats, Ryan, so I have one for you. I don't know if you saw the Randy Moss one for Brian Thomas.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, yeah, so Brian Thomas is the first player with 500 receiving yards on 30 or fewer receptions through 7 games, career games, since Randy Moss in 1998. So we have to go back to like Randy Moss 1998 to find this one. So I made this comment a couple weeks back and I got panned on it, where I said I thought that Brian Thomas would be a guy that was going to be a first-round pick in redraft in 2025. And I think right now maybe that happens because he's the kind of guy that have a huge second half, and he's the kind of guy that you get to the turn and you're like value him sort of like we did Drake London and Marvin Harrison Jr. this year, like that 1-2 turn. Hey, I'm going to take the upside wide receiver with Brian Thomas. So I think it kind of reminds me of peak Josh Gordon. So I don't want to get too crazy with Brian Thomas, but I think we're both in agreement that he needs to be inside of your top 10 in your dynasty wide receiver rankings right now. Before we get to the trades, I want to also talk about the reaction to Amari Cooper showing up in Buffalo. Really, like from a dynasty context, I think Cooper's an interesting one as like a 2-year window, certainly a 1-year window guy rest of the season. But sort of your take on what you're expecting with Cooper's involvement in this offense. In his first game there, he played like 17 snaps. He catches 4 balls, finds the end zone. But what's interesting to me is sort of the tertiary pieces all sort of had strong games as well. Josh Allen gets his most pass attempts of the season. It wasn't a massive amount, but he was 33, was more than he had in any particular game. Keon Coleman gives us a very solid line, gets 125 receiving yards. Khalil Shakir, 7 catches. Dalton Kincaid didn't really do a whole lot, but I don't think this is going to hurt him. Do you see this as a pie grows larger scenario where Cooper helps the whole offense? Am I being too enthusiastic about this? Where are you at on this Buffalo offense?
So I'll say this. Obviously Cooper did not run anywhere close to a full-time route share in his first game. That not super surprising. I know they were a little back and forth on how much he would play earlier in the week, just with him grasping the playbook and everything. But I would expect as soon as this coming week that he just takes over all of those empty Mac Hollins routes that he was running on the outside. Mac Hollins 1 target on 19 routes this past game. Amari Cooper had a 42% targets per route run rate in his first game here in Buffalo. So yeah, I think Cooper just steps in and kind of dominates targets here, like he's been doing everywhere else he's been over the past few years. We have a stat at Fantasy Points called first read target share. where Cooper has been between like 28 to 32% first read target share over the past 3 seasons. Only Dalton Kincaid has even been above like a 20% first read target share at any point in his career among all of the receivers on this Bills roster right now. So yeah, I think Cooper could step onto the field and continue dominating the targets once he's in a full-time route share. And I do think that translates rest of season to, at worst, like a high-end type of wide receiver too. So, and then you ask yourself, okay, well, what am I willing to pay for that in Dynasty? I think if you're a team that started off like 2-5 and Amari Cooper being a part of that reason why, I think it can make sense to cash out, right? I would absolutely love to get a late first for Amari Cooper right now. I would not even blink to send away Amari Cooper from a rebuilding team for a late first. That would be amazing. I think it's a little tougher from the other side, where if you're the buying side, how much can how can I expect difference-making production from Cooper at the wide receiver position? I'm not as sold on that, but I do think that the spike weeks are going to be there, right? He's clearly the best downfield target Josh Allen has had in quite a long time, and that usually leads to good fantasy results.
So I love where your head's at, and I think that this is sort of a game theory for how we can use these Amari Cooper trades, the Devontae Adams trades, the buy low window for the Tyreek Hill. There's a lot of these times where it's very difficult for the manager holding these older players, because I think a lot of people are like Ryan, where they would love to get somebody sending them a random first rounder. I'm going to hit the accept button. I've done everything I need. I'm trading a 30-year-old or near 30-year-old, and I'm getting a first round pick. So I think that the way you game theory that, if you are a guy looking to buy, is you send a heat check trade where I send Ryan an offer of my first round pick for Amari Cooper in a second. And if you're really, really looking to get out of Dodge, and you're really, really looking to get out of it, and your team is in a bad spot, like you said, 2-5, there's going to be managers who consider taking that haircut just to get into that first round, where you end up getting a 8-pick difference in terms of the actual picks, and you walk away with that older player. I think the heat check trade is not necessarily what the manager wants, and some will just automatically turn it down. But there's others who are going to think about taking it because it's so difficult to get into this first round and get those future firsts for these older players. What do you think of that, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in terms of what I'm willing to buy Cooper for, I'm a very risk averse type of dynasty manager when it comes to buying players with my future picks. I'd be sending like a second plus a third for Cooper and be pretty happy if that gets accepted. And I do think there's a chance that does get accepted, right? I was sending out that exact offer from the other side for a lot of my Amari Cooper shares last week. So yeah, I'd put it more at like a second plus a third would be about equilibrium value, where from either team situation, I could see doing that. But yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're trying to get the first, or you're trying not to pay the first if you're the buyer.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. And it's an interesting time for that. It's a great segue to our trades, but you've got a lot of older players right now where there's going to be a huge disconnect, where people holding these Derrick Henrys, people holding these Alvin Kamaras, people holding these Amari Coopers, and then their team might sort of trail off a little bit, and they're sitting there in the 6 or 7 seed. They immediately become sellers. So that's something to really monitor. What is the price point? Maybe shoot a couple of trades over, see if you can try to get a little information from these managers in terms of counters, and that might help you get a deal done as the season moves along if your team looks like a contender. Always think a little bit ahead here in Dynasty. And we're going to try to help you think a little bit ahead here in Dynasty as well. We want to give you a couple players that we think you should be trading for right now. And this is one where, Ryan, I was really excited to see you have our guy, DeVon Achane, listed, because I talked about him being a trade target on another show. Sunday's usage, for me, I was pretty pleased by it. And I think you talked about it a lot in your article. Why don't you talk about why DeVon Achane is a trade target?
Yeah. So I will just put it this way, right? If I had told you coming before the season, before week 1, that through 5 healthy games, that DeVon Achane has led the backfield in carries every single game he's been healthy, that he has 80% of his team's rush attempts inside the 10-yard line, and that he ranks second on the team with a 15% target share, more targets than Jalen Waddle in the games that they've played together, you'd be like, oh my God, DeVon Achane is the redraft RB1. Like I might consider him. I'm deciding between him and Christian McCaffrey and Breece Hall in the top 3 picks. That would be the reaction if I told you ahead of time that that's what the usage was going to be. That's what the usage has been. It has been kind of all of our wildest dreams. He's seeing almost 65% more expected fantasy points per game than he was in his rookie season. Like the whole thesis of this was the most efficient rookie running back season ever. He's probably going to earn more volume, just like Alvin Kamara did before him. All of that came true, and all of that's happened. The only problem is the efficiency has been terrible because this Dolphins offense has been non-functional with Tyler Huntley, with Tim Boyle, Tim Boyle, sidebar, I believe is 0-10 in games that he has a pass attempt in his NFL career. The total random stat I saw earlier this morning. But yeah, the bottom line is Tua Tagovailoa likely to play in week 8 from everything we're hearing right now. And I don't think the ideal time to buy was, of course, a couple of weeks ago. But I don't think the market or the fantasy manager's consciousness has really caught up to where it would have been preseason if we knew that this was the usage for DeVon Achane. So from a redraft context, I am happy to swap like a Joe Mixon, certainly, or I would even go maybe get a little crazy. I would say, yeah, I would trade a Saquon Barkley for a DeVon Achane right now, especially if I'm getting something coming back in redraft
in Dynasty.
on top.
In Dynasty
easily, yes.
Well, redraft, Ryan. You're saying redraft?
Yeah, I think in redraft, I think it's close. Like that's like pretty close to a toss-up for me. Who I prefer rest of season between Barkley and Achane.
So for me, I'm not there in redraft, but in Dynasty, I think that this is going to be maybe your last window to trade for DeVon Achane, because I think the subconsciousness of the Dynasty manager is I've been holding DeVon Achane. What happens if he doesn't perform with Tua? What happens if this offense doesn't take a big step forward, where my windows are potentially like the hope that Tua returns them to somewhat of a 2023 level Dolphins offense? This is my window to sell. I think there's going to be some Achane managers with that sort of belief. So I'm kicking the tires on DeVon Achane in every single Dynasty league, seeing if I can't get a little more. I have a lot. I have them in our league, Ryan. But I'd like to get a lot more. I'm with you. Don't know if I'm with you on the redraft take. The Mixon one's a different argument. The Saquon one, though, come on, you can't make that trade right after that heater yesterday, the Saquon Barkley revenge game. But
I mean, where he got vultured at the goal line twice, and where he only played like 50% of the snaps in a blowout. Yeah, I don't know. Saquon looks amazing. I agree. The workload, he's been vastly outperforming his workload, which we'd expect from Saquon Barkley, right? But Achane is capable of that and more, right?
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't.
No, I love it. I love it.
Rest of season.
I love it. I'm totally with you. I think this is one where some people in the comments are going to say, whoa, don't buy Dolphins. I think we're totally in lockstep. In Dynasty, I want as much DeVon Achane as possible. I think that the enthusiasm for DeVon Achane at the end of this Dynasty season, if Tua can stay healthy, is going to be similar to what we saw with the enthusiasm we had for Achane towards the beginning of the season, where everybody said, this is it. I've got the league winner. So I love that one. For me, I'm going to say, I still want, and we're recording this before Monday Night Football. For me, I still want to kick the tires, and I want to heat check the Baker Mayfield manager, because I think Baker Mayfield, like the window for Baker Mayfield, I think Baker Mayfield, like this is going to be his second consecutive season finishing as a QB1 in Tampa. I feel pretty confident in saying that from what we've seen in this Liam Cohen offense through 6 weeks, and the fact that Baker Mayfield is leading the NFL in touchdown passes, that I think he's a little bit more of a stable dynasty asset than some might venture. I think that there's a lot of Baker Mayfield take lock where people sort of refuse to believe the change that we've seen in Tampa. Last year, we saw him finish inside of QB1 land. And Ryan, we get an offensive coordinator change. He goes from the quarterback whisperer, Dave Canales, to a brand new offensive coordinator in Liam Cohen, and it's been even better this year. And this year we're seeing him spread it around. Last year was a ton of Mike Evans. It was a ton of Rashad White. This year it's been a ton of Chris Godwin, but also a very healthy amount of Mike Evans. Everything about Baker Mayfield, it's just he's got the swag. He has just enough as a runner where he gave us he had a multiple games this season with either a touchdown or like 35 plus rushing yards. Like everything about Baker Mayfield to me screams dynasty asset. And I think a lot of people view him as a short-term kind of fill-in superflex window quarterback. He also is like, it's the Jared Goff corollary, where all those years we thought Jared Goff was going to be replaced, but he wins too many games to be replaced because you end up picking in the bottom 10 slots in the NFL draft. There's not going to be that sort of threat to Baker Mayfield coming in there either. So Mayfield to me is just so locked in, but I think there's a disconnect with the dynasty managers and what you're actually getting on the field, and a guy who might be the starting quarterback in Tampa for like 5 years.
No, I'm kind of with you. So I posted this tweet a week or so ago, but I assume all of it is still approximately the same as what I'm about to say. So by fantasy points per dropback, if you just look at the top 12 quarterbacks this season, it is 5 hypermobile players. It's 6 guys that are in a Shanahan or a McVay tree style offense. And then it's Jared Goff where Ben Johnson is just kind of his own thing. So I think just the quarterback position in Dynasty right now, if you're not hypermobile, you need to be in an offense that has a schematic edge over the rest of the league. There are kind of these big winners on offense right now in the league and these big losers. The NFL middle class is kind of disappearing, right? And yeah, it's being driven by these offenses that have these large schematic edges. So yeah, a Baker Mayfield type of player, I am a lot more interested in than I would have been before the season, certainly. And it's not just because of the performance. It's because of just the league-wide trends we've seen where some styles of offense can hang against what all these defenses have been doing and have been catching up to over the last couple years. And some offenses just can't. And yeah, Mayfield is locked into an offense that can. He's one of the halves right now. So yeah, I totally agree. I don't think Baker Mayfield is just like a 1-year rental type of player at this point.
Yeah, and I think like he could even be like you talked about with the schematic edges. I think Mayfield, especially for teams that can get him as their QB2 in Superflex, he's the kind of guy that can really push you over the edge. You could end up with super teams with Mayfield as the QB2, delivering you like top 8 QB performance with a foundational quarterback to go with him. That's the kind of edge you need to win in your fantasy playoffs. Ryan, you've got a tight end you want to talk about.
I do. So in terms of buys, I think George Kittle is one of the better buys you can make in Dynasty right now on a contending team. He's kind of in this Goldilocks zone where if a rebuilding team has him, they're trying to get your late first out of you. I'm not like excited to pay the late first, but I think you could do it, right? I think it's an overpay. I think it's one I'm okay with though, right? Especially in a tight end premium league where just the edge of having one of these top 3 tight ends is going to make a bigger difference to your roster, to your championship odds than someone like an Amari Cooper that we were talking about earlier. I would be totally fine with going out and paying the iron price for Kittle, especially with Brandon Ayuk likely out for the rest of the season. Kittle was already leading the 49ers with a 22% target share this year. He's kind of not being forced to stay in and block this season nearly as much as we have seen in years past. They're really going to need him as a pass catcher this season. There have been a lot of talk recently about how the 49ers are seeing a lot more man coverage looks because Purdy kind of has struggled with them a little more. Deebo Samuel has kind of struggled with man coverage a little more throughout his career. And with Ayuk gone, they need Kittle to kind of be that man coverage beater now. He's kind of what they have. We'll see what Ricky Pearsall and Jacob Cowing end up looking like as the season goes on. But yeah, I think Kittle, from a week to week perspective, he has the highest ceiling of any tight end. He scored over, this is the stat I had was DraftKings points, so maybe call it 17 fantasy points in half of his last 16 games, right? Like you get the crazy boom weeks with Kittle. And even better, going forward next year, this Niners cap situation is really uncertain, right? Deebo Samuel isn't necessarily going to be on this team next year. So I think there's a lot of outs here to where even if you don't go and win the title, if you fall short with Kittle this year, I think there's outs to where he's still projecting as a top 3 tight end for next season, and you're not even all that mad about it. So that's the kind of buy I like to make in Dynasty for a quote unquote like win now, go win a championship type of team, is a player that has the out to still be valuable, to still maintain the value in the following season. Maybe more so than a manager that it needs to sell him off of a rebuilding team would even think.
Yeah, and for me, I'm gonna have a similar argument, but a player that I think is considerably cheaper, despite having a monster game in Week 7. I think a lot of David Njoku managers are going to be looking to sell right now. This is a train wreck of a team, and I don't think that there's a lot of people out there just, hey, we're getting Jameis Winston, therefore David Njoku is going to keep this up. I think there's still managers who are in Dynasty who are looking to sort of get out of Dodge, get out of this Cleveland Browns situation, and they love the idea of selling high after a 10-catch, 76-yard, and a touchdown performance. But I think for me, David Njoku last year gave us this league-winning upside. He finished the season at an incredible rate with Joe Flacco, and I think we might see lightning strike twice with Jameis Winston this year. I think it was really a Deshaun Watson issue more so than like necessarily. We saw it with Amari Cooper. We saw it with David Njoku. But David Njoku, to me, has a lot more insulation long-term than some might realize. He's 28 years old. He's on a contract that probably is going to bring him back to Cleveland. And there's a chance that we see much better QB play this year, but especially next year with an offseason to sort of get this thing right and find a replacement quarterback. So David Njoku, to me, is a guy who is very talented. He's shown over the last season and a half that he's capable of being a high target player at the tight end position and being a tight end capable of leading his team in targets. Super athletic player, is capable of boom weeks, presents a matchup problem for opposing defenses week in, week out. And when he's utilized as the main focal point, he delivers. I think we're going to get that now. And I think could be getting that heading into the 2025 season. Also, a healthy Nick Chubb helps David Njoku a lot with the play action game. If Cedric Tillman is going to be the leading receiver, then it's David Njoku every single week. So sort of a slightly cheaper way to play your George Kittle play with a much worse offense. David Njoku, your thoughts?
No, I like it. Yeah, kind of as you said, we have seen the ceiling out of Njoku. I will say I would not just assume that the Browns are going to start Jameis Winston immediately, unless there was some news that I've missed this morning. My guess is they would like to roll out Dorian Thompson-Robinson there if he's healthy, if they can, to see what they have in him. That's kind of the direction their season seems to be heading in at this point. But I do tend to agree that we'll see Winston at some point down the stretch. Whether that's because of the DTR injury or just them losing the locker room and them needing to play the very clearly superior quarterback. So yeah, I especially if this week like DTR goes out and the Browns kind of do nothing on offense, I think then I'd be very inclined to kind of quote unquote buy low at that point. But yeah, no, I think buying high is absolutely fine too, because people will be looking to sell. It's often easier to buy high for that reason.
I can see the DTR arguments, and I can see that sort of but for me, I think you nailed it. It's the locker room. Nick Chubb is back. Nick Chubb needs some sort of function there. You've got this guy who's like the heart and soul of the team, completely back. He's 29 years old. This might be sort of the last hurrah. And this team is just in dire need of a win. I don't know. For me, it's sort of like them having Jameis Winston being inactive was sort of to take a little bit of pressure off of Watson. I think we'll see the switch rather quickly. For me, I'm going to throw out one fun name that I think we talk about how this year has been the year of attrition, next man in backfields, RB2s producing when given the opportunity. For me, there's one running back that I want to try to get as a throw in for any single big trade and as a sneaky player to trade for, and that's Zach Charbonnet. And Ken Walker looks like the league winner, one of the league winners. Certainly where you drafted him in your Dynasty startup, you're feeling fantastic. If you traded for him this offseason in Dynasty, you're feeling great. And if you're a redraft listener, one of the best redraft picks you could have made at the running back position. But we saw Charbonnet give us back-to-back weeks of RB1 production, and Ryan Grubb is truly the RB whisperer. Every single week, the Seattle offense is producing fantasy scoring at a very high rate at the running back spot. I want access to it. It's very difficult for me to get Ken Walker, so I'm perfectly fine trading for his backup just as a contingent upside guy. This is the kind of player that I want to have on my Dynasty roster, next man in running backs who have two-way ability and they're like-for-like replacements. These are the kind of guys that can help you win leagues. Ken Walker misses a month. I'm in easy street with Zach Charbonnet in my lineup.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, we've seen, this season that if Walker goes down, Zach Charbonnet will walk into a 90% snap share. I would rather go after someone like a Braelon Allen, where the reason for that is he's kind of like Schrodinger's elite dynasty RB talent, right? The absolute best thing that can happen for someone like Braelon Allen is that he never plays, because he's going to maintain his value no matter what. Just the community has accepted he's awesome. He has no expectation to step on the field or produce or do anything. I guess that applies a little bit to Charbonnet as well. I don't know that the opinions on him as a player are as uniformly amazing in terms of his talent. But yeah, I think for similar reasons, it's hard to really get burned on making that type of acquisition. Because the worst thing that can happen is they play and they're not good, but you have a very clear sell window no matter what before that happens when the starter goes down.
Allen's such an interesting one because if you get him on your Dynasty roster, he's going to have a second contract when he's like 23 years old. So the amount of like enthusiasm for another team to get Braelon Allen if he goes into free agency eventually, provided he maintains this level of play. And it's also like at some point, we don't know that Breece Hall, they might not want to pay. And it might end up being a Braelon Allen situation where he just takes over as like a second or third year guy. But like you said, that's a great argument that the enthusiasm and the value that he presents. For me, it's more of a contingent upside type scenario. If I'm looking to go make trades, especially in trades where somebody's trying to get an asset from me where maybe they're not quite there, I really want to get Zach Charbonnet as an add-on whenever possible. And I think he's also a good just single trade candidate. Hey, I want to improve my running back depth. I'm willing to pay this, and maybe the manager sells him. So any week that Zach Charbonnet is in my lineup, I feel super enthusiastic. Final guy I want to recommend, and I know you're in on this player as well, Ryan, so I want to get your kind of take on this. But this is a buy high if there ever was one, but I'm trying to buy high on Drake London rest of the season. Drake London yesterday gives us another touchdown grab. He's been just simply sensational. If we remove week 1 out of the equation, the stats are even more impressive. He's had, since week 2, he's had only one game with fewer than 17 PPR points scored. The guy's a machine. This is a player trending up. He's going to be expensive, but he's also an interesting player because I think there's going to be a wide range of opinions on exactly where he should be ranked as a dynasty asset. He's a perfect player for me to tier up from if I want to trade a Garrett Wilson or a Marvin Harrison Jr. And yeah, I'm there. Marvin Harrison Jr., truly elite prospect, but it's just not clicking like we thought it would out the gate. There's still going to be managers willing to make that trade in most leagues where I can maybe squeeze a little bit on top of Drake London for Marvin Harrison Jr. And I'm even willing to kick the tires and see just how much I can get on top of Drake London for my CeeDee Lamb share. Because this year matters, Ryan. And I think that Drake London could be a guy that averages 20 points rest of the way and helps me win my leagues. And with the Atlanta Falcons, I have an ascending offense. I also have an idea that the quarterback situation is completely settled for the future because Kirk Cousins, with a real potential for like a Jordan Love light type takeover by Michael Penix at some point, if he really is the real deal like this franchise seems to think. So for me, Drake London's a guy that I'm willing to overpay for. I'm also willing to explore tier up and tier down type trades for him. Where are you at on London?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much in lockstep with you. Yeah, I would very clearly have him in that tier kind of with Garrett Wilson, with Marvin Harrison. He's going to outscore both of those guys most likely for the rest of the season. And yeah, as you say, on certain rosters, that matters more than on other rosters. But yeah, if I have the type of roster that wants the points this season, yeah, I totally fine making that trade. We feel probably a little less certain about his like individual talent as a player than we might for a Garrett Wilson or a Marvin Harrison, very arguably. But yeah, I think if you're getting anything on top of those guys, then that's a very clear trade I would like to make.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Ryan, this was a lot of fun. As always, need to get you back on Dynasty Life some point soon. Let everybody know where they can find your work once again.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at RyanJ_Heath. And then all of my written work, as well as all of the podcasts I drop, whether on Dynasty, on DFS, Underdog, Battle Royale stream every Friday night, all of that can be found on fantasypoints.com. Go check it out.
Yeah, no, highly recommend Ryan's work. Stick with us here at Player Profiler. My waiver wire show is dropping. My sleeper show is dropping. Dwayne McFarland on press coverage this week. Check out School of Scott, my podcast with Scott Barrett. You need to go over the Fantasy Points podcast network for that one, or on its own individual feed, School of Scott. And yeah, I'm going to be dropping more of these Dynasty Lives. Took a couple of weeks off. We were in those redraft streets, Ryan, but I got to talk a little Dynasty. It's middle of the season. It was Heath Cummings a couple weeks back, Ryan this week. Try to drop a Dynasty Life like every 2 weeks. We got you covered. We're going to help you win your league this season.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.